Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London.
And we are Unholy, two Jews on the news from Keshet Podcast. Hi, Jonathan.
Hello, Yonit. Each week we do this. Two Jews, one in Israel, one outside Israel, talking about Israel and the Jewish world from inside and from the outside. We have so much going on in the world, but I just am bursting because I know normally we wait till the end of the show to hand out our awards, our Chutzpah of the Week awards and our Mensch of the Week award. And normally I'm very patient and reserved and manage to hold it in, but I am bursting with this week's one. I just can't wait because everybody in this city, in London, and perhaps in the country is agog about just the most breathtaking act of chutzpah I think any of us can remember. And it involves the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson.
I'm shocked.
And it involves Christmas parties. And that is, to wind the clock back a year ago, London, like much of the world, was in the depths of lockdown where all kinds of social, not just gatherings, but interaction, social contact was banned, where you couldn't even go and meet immediate family, and some heartrending stories about people couldn't be with dying loved ones. It now emerges that in Downing Street at exactly that time, they were partying. They were having cheese, wine and nibbles in the depths of lockdown. And this cause of the party has the Prime Minister on the rack here in London. And it is just the most egregious act of chutzpah.
You know, obviously, Boris Johnson has had this on-again, off-again relationship with the truth. Usually they're on a break. But I wonder, does this matter at all? I saw this sort of snap poll that you put on Twitter that says, most Brits think he should resign. Does it matter? Will it hurt him that extensively? Well,
the big question always has been with him, is this going to be the thing that finally undoes him? And people have been saying he's a cat with 9 lives, things that would have killed off any normal politician. Somehow he survives, partly because being a kind of maverick rule breaker is part of his persona. But this goes so deep because people sacrifice so much. Christmas, I know we're going to talk about this on a future podcast, is such a big deal here. I think we've made joking reference before that Jews gather as families, all the time, every Friday night, dozens of festivals and chagim and days all throughout the year. But there are many families in this country, I don't want to sound judgmental, who it seems they only ever get together on Christmas Day. It's like the one time Christmas Day they meet their parents and grandparents and grandchildren. And that last year, Boris Johnson had to cancel Christmas. There was no Christmas gathering for families, and really terrible stories of people being alone. And the idea that at that time they were not just gathering with colleagues, but partying in Downing Street. And it's all been confirmed because a video emerged in which Downing Street officials are shown mocking up a pretend press conference where they're asked about this and laughing about it. And that has just gone down so badly. So I know it seems a kind of trivial cause, a party. Surely that's not going to bring down a prime minister, and maybe it won't, but it's the idea of the contrast, the hypocrisy of one rule for them, one rule for us. It would be the most egregious act of chutzpah normally, and we would hand out a major trophy to the British Prime Minister at the end of our show. But this time, I just thought it is the chat and dominating all talk here, and I thought I couldn't hold it in any longer.
Okay, but we're going to have to find someone to fill Boris's chutzpah shoes at the end of the program, because we will have to give out a chutzpah award. And
we will. There's no shortage. There's no shortage.
Right, and we'll also say that we're going to talk in this program with author Dara Horn about her brilliant book, People Love Dead Jews, which we both really loved, and also the Maccabees win not only in the Hanukkah story, but first, before anything else, Jonathan, we have to talk about former President Donald Trump's explosive new quotes on Netanyahu and American Jews, and they appear in Barak Ravid, diplomatic correspondent here in Israel, incomparable journalist, really, in his first book that is coming out. It's called Trump's Peace, the Abraham Accords and the Reshaping of the Middle East. Now, some of those quotes were published today in the Yediot Ahronot newspaper, and they're really amazing. What Trump says about Netanyahu, we have to say that the background for all this is the fact that Netanyahu finally, by the way, it took him some time to congratulate Joe Biden for winning actually winning the elections. But Trump saw this as an affront to him. He says that he is that Netanyahu is the politician that he helped more than anyone else. By the way, he's right about that. And he says, I was disappointed in Bibi just on a personal basis. It's a terrible personal betrayal. I haven't spoken to him since. And then he goes on to say two words I can't say out loud because my mother is listening to this podcast. Maybe you want to fill in the blank on what else he said about Netanyahu.
I think he said F him, didn't he? So that's my family-friendly version.
He did indeed.
I mean, these are, credit to Barak Ravid, as you say, really a first-rate journalist, and has made this patch of the relationship between Washington and Israel very much his own. But these are really arresting remarks from the former president, and it's interesting about what effect that will have on Bibi and his sort of future prospects of a comeback, because it's really arresting because it confirms, I think, but very dramatically and vividly, some things we suspected, really, and that is that in some ways, these two men are similar, and they are very, I think, transactional. And, it's about what they can do, what somebody can do for them. And if Bibi Netanyahu thought there was some kind of personal bond with Donald Trump, this suggests he was wrong.
Yeah.
It's only ever about loyalty to Donald Trump. And if you deviate from that, then that's the end of any kind of perceived friendship. I don't think Donald Trump had real friends. It was just about, you slavishly loyal to him? And if you're not, that's it. It's over. You're dead.
Well, look, I mean, it's pretty clear that the honeymoon is over, the marriage is over, and we're in the acrimonious divorce at this point between the two men. And as you say, it's really important because Netanyahu presented this as his biggest asset inside Israel and outside, right? And what is clear now is that Trump, how shall we say, is not his supporter anymore, and that means something in the Republican Party in the United States and in Israel. And he also blames Netanyahu, and he says, Netanyahu never wanted peace, which is also, I think, very, very important. He says, I strove for this, and Netanyahu didn't help me doing this. By the way, in other excerpts from the book, he discusses the American Jews. We'll bring this at length next episode, and Barak Ravid will be with us. But he says, I've said this for a long time, the Jewish people in the United States either don't like Israel or don't care about Israel, the Trumpian logic being if I was so good for Israel and they didn't support me, then they don't care about Israel.
I'm very excited that we're going to have Barak Ravid on, because I think it will be very good to talk through this aspect of it. There was a real disconnect between Trump's image of himself. He couldn't believe that he was not beloved by the Jews, that he was not hailed as some kind of king of the Jews figure. There was that disconnect between that on the one hand and the polling numbers and the voting numbers, where 3/4 of Jews, absolutely American Jews, stayed with the Democratic Party. They did not move over to Donald Trump. I think Orthodox Jews were the exception. But that was partly because there was a sense, I mean, look, mainly it was because American Jews are Democrats, but there was also a sense that for all this talk that he would say about himself, that Donald Trump was not, to coin a phrase, good for the Jews, that actually he carried around some pretty old, hoary stereotypes about Jews and had to be admonished, by the ADL and other groups during his presidency for referring to Jews so often in terms of money and what was going to affect their wealth. And I think we're going to hear in next week's podcast much more detail of how Trump really did see American Jews. And I think anyone who harbored any delusions about that is likely to be disappointed.
Okay, then we will continue now to talk some more about Jews.
Well, time for us to welcome to our little cozy pod here our special guest for this week. She is an acclaimed and multi-award-winning novelist in the United States, also a scholar in both Hebrew and Yiddish. But the reason why Yonit and I, we've been so desperate to get on Dara Horn is because of her new book, People Love Dead Jews, which is really an absolutely riveting, compelling, and a book luminous with ideas and intelligence. And for a long time, I think we both really, really wanted to have you on. So Dara Horn, a huge welcome to Unholy. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
You wrote, I think it was back in 2018, you wrote a piece for the Smithsonian Magazine about Anne Frank, which later became the first chapter of the book. And the first line of that article was, people love dead Jews. Living Jews, not so much. And I'm kind of curious how that conversation with the publisher sounded like when you said, I want to keep that as a title. I want to call the book People Love Dead Jews.
Wow. Well, I actually was really surprised to not get any pushback from my publisher about the title. I was very much steeling myself for that. I remember telling friends like, oh, my new book is called People Love Dead Jews, until the publisher makes me change it. They didn't make me change it. And I'm not really sure why. And I kind of wonder if, one thing that's sort of interesting about this book is with the publisher is that my publisher in the United States is Norton there, and also Norton UK, I know, is distributing it in the UK. There obviously are people who are Jewish who work at Norton. They don't happen to be working on this book. My editor is not Jewish. The people who are in publicity, marketing, whatever else are not Jewish. And I kind of wonder if they thought maybe it wasn't their place to push back on the title. Here, in the United States, we're now having this like huge, national discourse about race and, redefining those kinds of questions about diversity. And I sort of wonder if they just were too hesitant to push back. But I'm sure there were many internal meetings about it. Meanwhile, I also have, there's a companion podcast to this book called Adventures with Dead Jews. And for that, it was very much the opposite, because that was created by Tablet Magazine, which is a Jewish publication. And there, the production team and I were always joking about how we're going to make merchandise, like tote bags, coffee mugs, right? Like no one's going to take your seat at the pool if you have your Adventures with
I love
Dead
the
Jews
idea that there's all these editors sitting around in Norton going, maybe that's just how they talk. We can't say anything.
Maybe it's their secret language.
Well, and they publish all my previous 5 books were also with Norton, with the same editor, and, who's been wonderful for me for 20 years. And all of my novels are dealing with Jewish themes too. And, she's, I don't know. I think, to their credit, they didn't want to step on the writer's idea. So I was impressed.
So as you say, you've written novels before, but this is nonfiction. It is some of these essays are about lost Jewish communities, dead Jewish communities. They are richly reported, but the thing that really makes it, to my mind, stand out are these ideas. Somehow, this very new set of new takes on perennial questions. And one of the things you say in there is, look, obviously Jews are tiny people, are a kind of rounding error statistically, and yet we occupy an outsized place in the global imagination. And just for people who have not yet come to the book, what is that place that we occupy in the global imagination, would you say?
As I put it, people tell stories about dead Jews that make them feel better about themselves. Right, that there's some kind of psychological projection going on, and the Jews are playing this role of, not just the scapegoat, which is, that's something, a lot of people are aware of, but something a little bit deeper where people are telling stories about dead Jews that make them feel better about themselves, and also that require the erasure of actual Jews and, living Jews, actual Jews, and the content of Jewish culture.
So I want to continue that thought because, again, what you're talking about, this fascination with Jewish death does not allow for really the expression of Jewish life. And that's connected to anti-Semitism because what you would expect would happen, of course, is the more people know about what happened to Jews, the less they will hate them, right? Which is not exactly what is going on. One of your really, thought-provoking chapters is about the Holocaust exhibition, the Auschwitz exhibition in New York. And you talk about that. You said maybe we made a mistake when we thought that it would be important for everyone to know this on a granular detail. Yes. So I think that there was sort of an investment that was initially on the part of the Jewish community in the past, 30 to 40 years in Holocaust education, certainly in the United States, where, you have things like the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington that was opened in 1993. Around that same time is when you start getting, that was when Schindler's List came out, that film, and other films like it started coming out. You also had
at least in the United States, you had actually even the introduction of like mandatory Holocaust curricula in state schools in many states across the country. So, a lot of this was, championed by Jews. And what I think is interesting is that it was kind of a strategy in a way, because the idea was, not just sort of this idea of, memorializing people who were murdered in the Holocaust, but also this idea that, people would come to these museums or, read these books, see these movies, learn these things in school, learn what the world had done to the Jews, learn where hatred could lead, and they would then stop hating Jews. And, it's sort of what's interesting about that is it wasn't a ridiculous idea, but, perhaps we can say that it is 30 years later, maybe not entirely effective. One of the things I mentioned in the book is, when Jews are, let's say, trolled on social media and they're photoshopping you into a gas chamber, the problem, that person knows about Auschwitz. The problem is not an education problem. And so, that's sort of, something. And when I talked about in the book, the Auschwitz show in New York, this was an exhibit that really sort of exemplifies that the shift of the way Holocaust memorialization goes from when it sort of leaves the Jewish community. They have videos of survivors talking on a loop about how all you need is love. And I'm just standing there in this room. I'm so insulted by this because the Holocaust didn't happen because of a lack of love. It happened because entire societies abdicated responsibility for their problems. And then I'm thinking about this as a Yiddish scholar. There's a fair amount of survivor literature in Yiddish about the Holocaust. I couldn't think of anything that talks about love. Right? That doesn't come up, right? What do survivors talk about when they're speaking in Yiddish to other Jews? They talk about their destroyed centuries-old Jewish communities, right? They talk about Jewish national independence. They talk about they talk about self-defense. They talk about Zionism. So, it's just it was just so absurd that it had been turned into this sort of universalizing message, right? And that's the idea, this universalization of this, which serves to erase the Jewish character of this. And I've been ranting for a while, so I should probably stop, but there's a lot I have to say about this.
I like it. And I like the fact you're getting a bit angry because the book has a lot of anger in it. And that's, and that's really bracing. And I wanted to pick up exactly this point you're making about this need, this appetite for a kind of feel-good, uplifting message that comes out of it. And you say that there is that, even in the slightly more rarefied field of Holocaust literature, there's this expectation that the stories be uplifting, that they be sad but beautiful, and that they leave the reader with some grace at the end. And Yonit knows, and listeners to Unholy know, that I myself have been working on a book in this area on the Holocaust about the first Jew to escape from Auschwitz. And, I've been wrestling with this myself because I know there is that kind of need. I know what you're talking about. You say in the book that you think it's quite a Christian demand that these stories end this way. But I just wondered whether actually there are quite a lot of Jews who also want that, and particularly want it even from an encounter, a human encounter with a survivor, when they want to come away feeling somehow inspired, that in other words, that we're not just on the receiving end of this phenomenon, that maybe we're part of it too.
Well, I think that if you're looking for inspiration, the Holocaust isn't a great place to start.
But survivor stories, maybe.
But even survivor stories, what's interesting to me is the way that there's this glamorization of survivors is sort of oh, look, these people went and rebuilt their lives. Yeah, some did. But a lot didn't. There are a lot of people who died by suicide. There are a lot of people who are mentally ill, who are really not able to, who had lost their children and then, had subsequent families and were unable to parent those people, adequately. There are a lot of people who were not this shining story of mental health and success after this. There's an enormous amount of trauma. And, we just sort of erase that because people like the happier story. We want there to be a moment of grace. We want there to be an epiphany. These are all very Christian terms. I don't think that's a coincidence. And it was very glaring to me in studying, because I did my doctoral work in comparative literature. So I had to take all those classes about, literary theory and stuff. But then I also was studying Hebrew and Yiddish literature. And I was wow, the writers I'm studying in Hebrew and Yiddish literature, they don't give you those things. You know, like, nobody's ever saved, right? Nobody's ever, like, given a moment of grace or an epiphany. Like, no, they never have any of that. Like, and I just, you know, it's a different model of literature where the model is about, like, it is about resilience. It is about endurance. But there's this idea that, like, you know, you can't, like, try to sort of give this, like, you know, optimistic view about the human experience while still, like, trying to make sense of the world. So, but to your point about, you know, Jews are part of this and wanting there to be some hopeful story, like, yeah, I mean, I think all people are, right? I mean, all people want some kind of, like, sense of hope for the future. Okay, I mean, you know, that's not unique to, you know, any one tradition or religion. But, like, you know, to me, like, you know, yeah, like, if you're going to be learning about the Holocaust, like, you're not going to, if you're getting inspiration from stories about the Holocaust, like, maybe you're not actually learning about the Holocaust.
I have to, be the Israeli in the conversation and ask, you know, I was reading the book, and while there was a terror attack in Jerusalem, in the Old City, and a Jewish man was stabbed. And of course, the headline in, I think it was the Daily Mail, said something like, Israeli security forces shot Palestinian man dead in Jerusalem. This happens a lot. And I remember thinking to myself, and going back to your book called People Love Dead Jews, I said, you know, people don't even love dead Israelis. That was my feeling. And I kind of want to interject with the Israeli topic, which you relate to a little bit in the book. But you actually say that claim that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are really not the same thing, right? We can be anti-Zionist but not anti-Semites is actually quite an old one. It's not a new argument.
Correct. So I give the history of this claim, which that explicit version of it goes back to the early years of the Soviet Union. In fact, before the founding of the State of Israel. This is after the Bolshevik Revolution. You had this sort of attitude among the Bolsheviks to try to get the Jewish masses of the former Russian Empire on their side, and they created these Jewish sections of the Communist Party, whose goal was, like, to spread, you know, Marxism among the Jewish masses. Their slogan was, "We are not anti-Semitic, we're just anti-Zionist," right? I mean, and by the way, we're also anti-religious. So what that means is, like, you know, Jews are awesome as long as they're not practicing Judaism, supporting Zionism, studying Hebrew, and then any organizations that were doing those things are immediately shut down, and the people who are doing those things become enemies of the state. So, you know, the thing is, what's interesting about it is, in the course of not being anti-Semitic and merely being anti-Zionist, they, of course, managed to, you know, persecute, imprison, torture, and murder thousands of Jews. And then spread this slogan eventually, you know, years later to their client states in the developing world, including, of course, in the Arab world. So, that's the origins of that slogan. But I even trace it back, that concept, even earlier than that. I have a section in the book where I talk about two forms of anti-Semitism, what I call Purim anti-Semitism and Hanukkah anti-Semitism, named after the holidays that celebrate triumphs over them. And, you know, Purim anti-Semitism is this, like, very easy to see thing where it's like, big, there's a big bad guy who's like, let's kill all the Jews. Like, there's no ambiguity. But Hanukkah anti-Semitism is something a little different, because if you think about the Hanukkah story, there never is this idea that, we're going to kill all the Jews. The goal is the same, which is to destroy Jewish civilization, but it can be accomplished while keeping Jews technically alive, but just editing how they're allowed to be Jewish.
This is so interesting. It goes to something Yonit and I talked about on an earlier show, this idea of Jewish behavior being policed somehow. And
yes.
Sort of, your word editing is very, very interesting. And just the idea that throughout history it recurs, that there's always something that it's different in each generation, that Jews are meant to give up. And,
yes.
and you've taking it back to ancient Rome, and that was, the ancient world is fascinating, and the implication of what you're saying is now it's Zionism. You know, that's the thing Jews have got to give up. But
and it was in the Soviet Union as well, right? I mean,
sure.
And before the State of Israel, right? So
I
realize I didn't really address your question about they don't like living Jews either. But I guess when I say people love dead Jews, I just want to address that. And I want to go, Jonathan. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just want to say that, you know, what I really mean is that basically, like, part of that editing is that people are only comfortable with Jews when they are powerless. So, which can mean dead, obviously, but politically impotent too. So there's a profound discomfort with living Jews, and especially living Jews who have any kind of agency.
And so that would
yes.
make Israel a big
right,
problem.
Exactly, because it's like Jews aren't supposed to do that.
You say something towards the end of the book, saying, we're talking about the sort of rise in anti-Semitism in the United States, and you're talking about the reasons. And you say, now that people who remember the shock of the Holocaust were dying off, the public shame associated with expressing anti-Semitism was dying too. In other words, hating Jews was normal. Now, I'm trying to fight off the urge to ask you for an epiphany, but what can be done? Okay, now that you have so accurately and beautifully, brilliantly, I should say, kind of define this problem, what can we do about it?
What can we do about this? I mean, I used to sort of resent this question because I'm like, anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem to solve, right? Like, we're not the people causing this problem, right? Like, in a sense, it's not Jews' problem to solve. But of course, the challenge is like nobody else is thinking about this. So maybe we need to think about this more. And I think a lot of the ways that we talk about anti-Semitism with a non-Jewish audience or non-Jewish community is like itself very detrimental. And what I mean is like these kinds of arguments that Jews will often make to a non-Jewish society where they're like, oh, Jews are like the canary in the coal mine, right? Like once Jews are attacked, it's like a sign of the decline of the society. Like that is a denigration of one's own dignity to say that, right? Because then what you're saying is like, you should care when Jews are murdered or maimed because, it might be an ominous sign that real people might later get attacked. Like, this has sort of been a strategy of the Jewish community that I don't think is effective because I do think it involves a denigration of Jews' humanity. So my idea would be to flip the narrative. And what I mean by flipping the narrative is, what we see in these sort of public, sort of memorials to the Holocaust and things like this is erasure of the actual content of Jewish culture and civilization. This is how the book opens with this, incident that happened at this Anne Frank Museum in Amsterdam in 2018, where there was an employee who, a young Jewish man who worked there, and they wouldn't let him wear his yarmulke to work. They made him hide it under a baseball hat. He appealed this decision to the board. The board deliberates for 4 months, and then they finally relent and let him wear his yarmulke to work. As I put it in the book, 4 months is a really long time for the Anne Frank Museum to ponder whether or not it was a great idea to force a Jew into hiding. And, it turns out that, that something very similar had happened, 6 months earlier at the same museum where they have these audio guides in all different languages. And, it says English, and there's a British flag, and it says Francais, and there's a French flag until you get to Hebrew. Hebrew, no flag. No flag, right? And I'm like, there's just obvious erasure going on. And then you have also this universalization of the Holocaust, which is we can never talk about the Holocaust in some non-Jewish context without talking about this is shows how all bigotry is bad, and this shows how, all genocide is bad. I'm like, okay, yeah, bigotry and genocide are bad, but this is not normally how we teach about historical atrocity by turning it into this universalist message, right? And what it also does is it erases, first of all, thousands of years of anti-Semitism that precede it, and second of all, the content of Jewish civilization. What's really amazing about it, which is this development of this independent civilization that sort of is this counterculture that weaves its way through the history of the West. So what if we were to include Jewish history as it weaves its way through the history of the West? So a simple example of this, how about literacy? What do you learn in school when you learn about mass literacy? Generally, they teach you that until the printing press was invented, nobody knew how to read except the clergy and the nobles and the royalty. But then, hooray, the printing press is invented. Yay, technology. Yay, industrial production. And finally, poor people are finally able to learn how to read. Well, that's a nice story, but it's a lie. Because Jewish communities had at least universal male literacy for at least 1,000 years before the printing press. I mean, poor Jewish kids in 8th century rural Libya all knew how to read. Think about what that teaches you, right? So, I mean, there's a lot, I think, that non-Jewish cultures have to learn about, the actual content of Jewish civilization that really would upend a lot of the stories we tell ourselves about what history means.
Since we're talking about learning, and I fear this may have to be our last question to you, Dara, but I came away thinking pretty well everything in the book struck me as right and struck me as true. including actually the quite difficult stuff you say about America, the idea that it was some golden Medina, exceptional place, and you have a wonderful chapter about Ellis Island. That may too be wrong and maybe a myth. There was a lot of really heavy-duty anti-Semitism that greeted the first Jews to come to America, or the big wave anyway, the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. So is it possible you think everything in the book is right, everything is true, but it's still nevertheless terribly bleak view to hand on to your children? And we're all, the three of us in this conversation, Jewish parents. I just wondered if this is a very difficult message to imbue into a next generation.
I'm going to say no, because I think that what is amazing about Jewish history and the Jewish present is not this litany of horror. I think you have to be realistic about that litany of horror. But what is amazing about it is the creativeness and resilience and reinvention of Jewish civilization through all those events. I was talking before about like what non-Jewish societies can draw from this. I'm going to give one silly example, not silly, actually, but one really sort of surprising example of that from my own work is as I mentioned, I'm an academic. Also, I do a scholarship in Yiddish and Hebrew literature. I was about 10 years ago at an American conference for Hebrew scholars, and pretty much everybody there was like, a Jewish academic who studies Hebrew, except there were 3 people at that conference sitting in the back of the room who were from the Wampanoag Nation, which is a Native American nation. And they were at this Hebrew conference because they are trying to revive Wampanoag as a spoken language, which hasn't been spoken in, maybe 200 or 300 years. And they're at this Hebrew conference because they said, we want to know how you did it. Because Hebrew is the only ancient, only sort of dead language that was revived as a spoken language. I mean, this is an astonishing thing. It's unique in world history. And, I think the story of modern Zionism is astonishing in world history. I mean, these are really unique, amazing things that I have introduced to my children. And I think, for my children, when they're learning, you learn these things just as part of traditional Judaism, right? I mean, that's sort of, to me, is sort of the most interesting thing is like, you teach children about the Hanukkah story while they're living in a non-Jewish society. It resonates for them, right? Like, that doesn't mean they have to go become like, zealots, right? Like, the Hashmonaim, the Maccabees were not necessarily like, people I want to live my life according to their ways. But like to my children living in a non-Jewish society, like this is kind of familiar, right? Like this idea that like how Jewish you are going to be is being sort of, that there's this outside society that maybe is perhaps not even consciously imposing its desires on you. That's something that my children really can relate to. And then it gives them the language to articulate that and also to sort of have their own integrity. I have this passage in the book where, and I think that my children draw that from the Jewish tradition, that sense of integrity and the sense of being part of this larger historical story that will continue into the future. I think that is very inspiring. What's inspiring is not like, it's so sad these people died in the Holocaust. Like because that's not inspiring to me. What's inspiring to me is that you do have this this Jewish civilization that doesn't just endure, but creatively reinvents itself, and that every person who participates in this community has an opportunity to be part of that creative reinvention. And I think that gives people a core of integrity, and that's something that Jewish parents really can give to their children through an engagement with this tradition. And, that's true wherever we live as Jews in the world today.
This was such a wonderful conversation. We loved the book, and we're so glad that you came on to talk about it.
Yeah.
And we really recommend it to everyone. Thank you so much, Dara. Thanks for talking to us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So the book is People Love Dead Jews by Dara Horn, published by Norton. Both Yonit and I just found it a tremendously stimulating read. And we thank Dara Horn for coming on the podcast. And Yonit, we have some awards to give out.
Indeed. It's our, weekly tradition, Jonathan, our best example of Mensch of the Week and the most egregious example of Chutzpah. You already used up the Chutzpah at the beginning, but yes.
I was, as bursting with urgency to give that award to Boris Johnson because of the Downing Street party, but there is a very close contender, and that is sent in by regular Unholy listener, old friend of mine, Marshall Yum, living in Israel, who noticed that officials in Saudi Arabia have conducted the biggest ever crackdown on camels that receive Botox injections. Why do they receive Botox injections? Because they are contestants in the King Abdulaziz Camel Festival. I kid you not. There is a beauty pageant for camels in Saudi Arabia in which judges decide the winner based on the shape of an animal's head, neck, hump, dress, and posture. And some contestants' trainers have been using Botox and facelifts and other cosmetic alterations to make camels more attractive. And those ruses and tricks are now to be banned. And Marshall thought of this because we did talk about beauty pageants in our Chutzpah award last week. So for the 2 weeks running, we have singled out the organisers of beauty pageants for the Chutzpah award. But this week must be the one that is the Chutzpah of Chutzpah, a camel contest, beauty contest in Saudi Arabia, no longer being allowed or tolerating facelifts and Botox.
We live in a very strange world, Jonathan, don't we? This is just, first of all, it's terrible cruelty to animals, and I would just say it proves the point we were trying to make last time. We can erase the whole idea of beauty pageants for human beings. Then
we
the
really
rest.
can.
But
the funny thing is, part of why people hate beauty pageants is they say, this is like a cattle market, it's like a meat market, treating women as animals. This is a literal livestock beauty pageant of camels, and now they can't use Botox. I mean, you do think, but yeah, as you say, this is a strange world we live in.
Okay, well, at least I can now do the Mensches Awards because you did the chutzpah. So I am sitting high and mighty on my very good story here, which is a little bit of Jewish pride, even a lot of Jewish pride. The Maccabees at Yeshiva University in New York, who hold the longest current winning streak in the NCAA tournaments, undefeated to date for 36 consecutive wins. Now, think of the fact that the Macs they have their studies, they have their religious studies, and they suffer from the fact that their fans are all on Zoom and not in the actual court, and yet they still won. And Ryan Terrell, who's a guard on the team, said, "We want to show that Jews can play basketball and make our Jewish community proud." So that's a good story. And I think their last winning streak was actually during Hanukkah, so this is excellent. I don't want to say Jews rule basketball because we all know that's a lie, but still, it's a nice story coming out from.
I love the idea that the Maccabees had an unbroken and much longer than predicted successful, victorious streak during Hanukkah.
Yes.
I mean, that is so on message.
Nice.
It's just perfect.
Nice. Now, since the person I married played for the rival team of the Maccabees in Israel, not the Greek, by the way, but Hapoel Tel Aviv, I just have to make note of the fact that the Maccabees here in Israel not doing as great, but I don't want to ruin the story, so forget that.
So these are the American Maccabees. I love that you are married to basketball royalty in Israel. That is serious yichus in Israel, right? Because basketball is such a big deal in Israel that a connection to a real-life basketball player, that is the kind of, so you're beaming there. I'm
just saying it was chosen just because of that reason. No other reason whatsoever.
It is a wonderful accolade. So that is Chutzpah and Mensch for this week. I think remains to say, if you enjoyed what we do and if you enjoyed listening to our conversation with each other and with Dara Horn, recommend us to your friends, give us an A-star, 5-star rating and a nice little review. Lots of you have been doing that and we appreciate it. It helps get Unholy in front of more listeners. And people to thank, Yoni.
Yes, indeed. We want to thank Lior Friedman, our executive producer, and Rom Atik and Omer Primat and Irad Eshel for original music. And we shall meet next week, Jonathan.
See you then.